Paul Finebaum thinks this will be a transitional year for the Vols. Now, I guess in a lot of ways it could be, but I tend to disagree. I think Tennessee has a coaching staff still intact. They didn't lose Tim Banks. They have a quarterback. To me, those are the biggest areas of transition. Every program is going through rebuilding of a different phase of its football team. With Tennessee, it's the offensive line. But other than that, they look pretty good. Maybe the defensive line to some extent, but they've got quality depth coming back. I'm a little confused, to be real honest with you, what Paul means by transition year, because I don't see that. As a matter of fact, I see the opposite, Caleb, because Tennessee has so many guys coming back that they paid NIL money to return. I actually don't see this as a transition year. Tennessee may not be as good as I think, but that doesn't mean it's a transition year to me. Do you see it as a transition year?
No. And honestly, I want to read Paul Finebaum's quote because it was a little confusing what he was trying to convey with the quote. But obviously, the transition year is what kind of stood out to us because it's the one that makes the most sense. But his exact quote on the Paul Finebaum show was, most of the experts think Tennessee will go through somewhat of a transitional year, having lost so many key players. They still have Nico. The schedule, I don't think playing Syracuse, that game is in Atlanta. I mean, Syracuse is a much improved program, but I don't see a lot there. I think they can manage Syracuse. That Georgia game is early. I think the games that would worry me are Georgia, at Alabama, and at Florida. Other than that, I think Tennessee can handle that schedule pretty well. So while he says most of the experts think they're in a transitional year, he then goes on to make the case of why they're not in a transitional year. Because I agree they should be able to handle Syracuse. And Dave, if your season comes down to 3 games and the other 9 are circled wins, I don't think you consider that a transitional year, do you?
No, I don't. And a transitional year to me is going from Peyton Manning to T. Martin. A transitional year to me is going from Philip Fulmer to Lane Kiffin. For it to truly be a transitional year, and I'm not trying to pick apart what Paul's saying at all, there is a transition, but how many starters is Tennessee actually losing? Let's say 5 on the offensive side, 6 if you want to count 2 receivers, if you want to count 3 offensive linemen and a running back. Defensively, they'll have to replace Keenan Pili, but he barely played. They'll have to replace some depth on the defensive line. Jermon McCoy's injury doesn't help, but he's supposed to be back at cornerback for the Vols. I agree with Dylan. Dylan says it's probably more of a make or break year. That to me is a better way of describing the 2025 season. I just don't see transitional year.
Yeah, I don't either. And I'm with Dylan too. And honestly, when you say transitional year, you're almost starting to make an excuse for Josh Heupel in that way. It reminds me of Dave, funny enough, I was in college at the time, but I don't know who it was. I didn't know all the report. I was a reporter for the Beacon. I didn't know all the reporters covering Tennessee. So I was around the same room as you. I didn't know who you were. But
basically, Bud Ford at the time.
Oh, there you go. So it's 2007, and I remember when Tennessee lost to Cal, and then Florida got blown out, and they were 1-2. And I remember one reporter saying, "Tennessee's young; they'll be okay long term." I'm like, that was the dumbest thing I heard anybody ever say. What do you mean they're young? They have a senior quarterback right now. I don't think they should have looked at this as a rebuilding year with Eric Ainge as a senior. And
it was
2007.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I'm like, sometimes when I hear the words transitional year or rebuilding year, it just seems like an excuse to basically allow a team to underachieve in a year where they should be able to compete for things. And Tennessee has a specific plan. So I think it would be a major mistake to call it a transitional year. And also, you're right, with key pieces, we're talking about losing on offense, the interior of the offensive line, I get it. That's a concern. They seem to have done a decent job trying to restock that in the offseason, though. And outside of that, okay, so they lose some key receivers. Nobody's really going to miss nobody's going to really miss their receiving core from this past year. It wasn't anything to, blow you away over. So losing those guys is not that big of a deal. You brought up the transitional year from 97 to 98. The funny thing was everybody freaked out about Tennessee losing Marcus Nash Turned out Peerless Price was better. Marcus Nash was just a product of Peyton Manning. So Tennessee got better because they lost Marcus Nash. No disrespect to Marcus Nash. But
now, let me throw this out because Derek didn't exactly say this, but he led me off to it. So a transition year could be, you could describe it at this year because you're going from primarily Pruitt's guys in key roles to Heupel's guys in key roles. So I could see that argument. Did Paul Finebaum address that at all? That this personnel, this roster is now more Heupel's, especially the starters, than Pruitt as they were last year?
No, he didn't. It was vague. It was on a show. It was asked about it. So it was more of this is what experts are seeing. I will tell you, experts may be seeing this, but guys, let me be very clear on this. What Vegas thinks matters more than what experts think, because experts just can't get it's really, you know this, Dave, and we like covering college football nationally, but I'll tell you just from my perspective, when you cover it nationally, it's really hard to get the details right about every team you're covering. It's almost impossible, isn't it? No. But who does do that is Vegas. And Vegas is way higher on the Vols than experts because Vegas has Tennessee's win total at 9.5, which is just as many games as Georgia and Texas, the top 3 teams in the SEC. And they have a financial stake in it.
I would say one thing the show's not going to do. The show's not going to, if Tennessee's 8-4 at the end of the year, we're not going to look back and say, whoa, Tennessee, and please hit that like button. We're not going to say, whoa, Tennessee had to replace all those guys. That's just fine. 8-4 is okay. It's transition year. A transition year to me, I know this sounds insane considering they ran the table, but if you consider what they lost in Leonard Little, Dwayne Goodrich, no, not Dwayne Goodrich, Peerless Price. No, they didn't lose Peerless. Who did they lose? They lost Leonard Little, Peyton Manning, and they lost Marcus Nash. That's right. They lost about 7 significant players. To me, that would have been a transition year. If Tennessee goes 8-4 that year, sounds crazy because they went 13-0. But if they go 8-4 in the regular season, I'm like, oh, that's a transition year. No big deal.
That's kind of what it's funny you say that because I know people talk about 98, but 98 was loaded with talent. 2000 was a transition year, was a really good example where Tennessee fell to 2-3. Casey Clausen comes in, wins the final 6 games. They go 8-4. It was like the first non-top 10 finish for Tennessee in nearly a decade. I think you were covering Tennessee at the time. Nobody freaked out about it, right? People thought, oh, yeah, Tennessee happened to lose. Because remember, after 99, they lost all those players early to the NFL. Deion Grant, Sean Ellis, those guys. And 2000 was the first year they started outside of the top 10. But everybody knew that was like a weird rebuilding year in a legendary run. And so no one freaked out.
Let's have a fun little exercise for a second, can we? Let's go back to 2008. Okay, you go to Dave Clawson. That's a transition year, right? 2008.
Absolutely.
2009. Well, you go to Lane Kiffin. That's a transition year, right?
1000%.
2010. You go to Derek Dools. That's a transition year. Okay.
And see why I say Derek Dooley inherited a tough situation.
Right. And then at some point, you go Sal Sunseri. That's a transition year. No, I'm not even joking. And then you go to Butch Jones. That's a transition year. We're up to 5 transition years since 2008. Okay. And at one point, Butch Jones lost a coordinator too, right?
Butch Jones pushed out a coordinator. To be fair, let's be fair. He pushed out Mike Bahayek and his offensive coordinator to get Mike DeBoard. That was a smart move because Mike DeBoard was a better offensive coordinator. But then he pushed out John Jancic to get Bob Shoop. And while Bob Shoop was a good defensive coordinator, he didn't mesh well with Butch Jones's position coaches, and that created a catastrophe in 2016 on defense because they had different philosophies.
So that was a transition year. All right. So you go to Jeremy. What about Justin Wilcox? What year was he gone?
Here's the one year you could say wasn't a transition year. There were 2 in this run you're saying. There were 2 that were not transition years if you're talking about coaches. Yes. One of them was 2011. Jim Chaney and Justin Wilcox came back. But Dave, that 2011 team, you're going to laugh at him saying it because I know you don't like him, but like Derek Dooley was right. So Derek Dooley took over in 2010. Going into 2011, he said at one point, well, this is more like year 1. Last year was year 0. Now I know that's laughable to say, but that was a little fair, wasn't it, given what he inherited at Tennessee? at that time.
Well,
So like,
I'm not saying it's not fair, and I'm not saying that what Paul Finebaum said is wrong. I just don't see it like that. I see a coaching staff that comes back intact. I see a quarterback that comes back. To me, that's the two most important things you would want is an
I totally
intact
agree.
coaching staff and a quarterback. And not to mention they it'd be different if Keenan Pili played all of last year and you're talking about replacing him, but he didn't play much of last year. So that transition came last year. It's not coming this year with Jeremiah Telander or Arian Carter being the quarterback of the defense. I think it's going to be Telander. I'm not completely sure. We'll get to the poll question. The show represented by Banks & Jones, Tennessee's trial attorney, banksandjones.com, as they bring you today's tough question.
Why Banks & Jones? Well, it's because they're Tennessee's trial attorney. You can play to win with Banks & Jones because they'll go to trial. You've heard of other lawyers. They say they'll go to trial and fight for you. They won't. They just want to settle. That's the easiest way out. Well, that's not Banks & Jones, led by T. Scott Jones. They won't settle. They'll go to trial for you. Tennessee's trial attorney. They play to win. Truly, Tennessee's trial attorney when it comes to criminal defense or personal injury. Why settle? It's Banks & Jones. T. Scott.
All right, Caleb, let's get to the poll question. And it's today's tough question brought to you by Banks & Jones, Tennessee's trial attorney, banksandjones.com. What do you got, Caleb? And you're muted, I believe.
Sorry, no, I'm trying to pull up the poll question, and I'm having some technical difficulties in my situation, guys. So just bear with me for a couple more days.
I got it right now. Are Vols in a transition year? No, just win, 83%. Yes, give them a break, 17%. Guys, it's been 4 years, and I wrote about how Josh Heupel should be more appreciated than he has been over his 4 years, and I stand by that. But that doesn't mean just because you made the college football playoff that you can throw in a mulligan and just get by in your 5th year. Your 5th year, you should be competing for championships. And I think Josh Heupel will compete for championships, and I define that by making the college football playoff. If he doesn't make the college football playoff, forget about 9 or 10 wins. If he wins 9 and gets in, that's a successful season. If he wins 10 and doesn't, that's not a successful season. That's the new barometer of a successful season. Did you make the playoff? So if Tennessee doesn't make the playoff this year, I'll sit here and I'll tell you that's a disappointing season, in my opinion. No doubt.
Sometimes we don't see the forest for the trees because we cover things so have you ever covered Tennessee, Dave, and you're so tied into the program you don't stop and like think about like sometimes simpler explanations can explain something? And
I'm not following you. What exactly do you mean by that?
we cover Tennessee so deeply, we kind of are forgetting. We're kind of somewhat forgetting about the simplest explanations for a program sometimes, which is returning your quarterback, returning your coach, and returning your staff. So let's think about Tennessee for a minute. They went 10-3 last year, made the college football playoff. They have their quarterback back. This is the first time since 2022 they're returning their starting quarterback. This is also the first time since 2022, Dave, that they return both coordinators. And it's the first time since Josh Heupel's been at Tennessee that they didn't lose one staff member. When you take all that into consideration, does stability mean nothing? I mean, those are huge deals, what we're just saying right now. I mean, the simplest part about football is, what's the number one way you determine if a team is going to have a drop-off from the previous year? Did they lose their quarterback? That's always like rule number one, right?
Okay, let's say for a second that Paul Finebaum's right, and this is a transitional year. Well, if he's right and this is a transitional year, then recruiting hasn't been what it should be. If this is a year that Tennessee is short on talent because they can't fill in the gaps of guys they lost last year, then Josh Heupel hasn't recruited at a high level like we thought he would. I mean, you should have guys that are ready to plug in and play. Again, today's tough question brought to you by Banks & Jones, Tennessee's trial attorney.